The sixth conference of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, hosted in Stockholm in 1911, welcomed delegates from 24 nations. Over 1,000 additional guests purchased tickets to witness meetings and addresses by such eminent figures as the organization's founder, Terry Chapman Catt, and Sweden's own Nobel Prize-winning author, Selma Lagerlöf. Today, the best remembered musical offering of the conference is a choral suffrage song composed for the opening ceremony. The relative fame of its composer, Hugo Alfvén, likely explains the song's recent publication. A less internationally recognized figure, however, otherwise dominated the conference's musical proceedings: Sweden's leading female organist, conductor, and composer, Elfrida Andrée. During the conference, Andrée presented music at least 3 times, all with the Women's Choir of Gothenburg, which she led with her niece Elsa Stanhammar. On June 11th, they participated in a church service in which Andrée herself played organ. On June 12th, the choir introduced Alfvén's suffrage song. That evening, they performed the musical highlight of the conference at the welcome reception. Andrée conducted the premiere of a suffrage cantata that she had especially composed for the occasion, to a Swedish text by feminist historian Sigrid Leonhufvud. This 30-minute cantata for women's voices and full orchestra is a rare example of a large-scale political composition written and performed by women and targeted to an audience of women. As I demonstrate, it not only reinforces the primary themes of the conference, but musically emphasizes the ideology of its composer. During her lifetime, Elfrida Andrée was as well known in Sweden for being a pioneer for women's rights as for her contributions to music. Andrée first gained prominence as a groundbreaking organist. Soon after moving to Stockholm in 1855, she began studying at Sweden's foremost musical institute, the Royal Musical Academy. In 1857, she stood for her organist certification exam. She became the first woman in Sweden to take and pass it. Qualifications aside, Andrée's career prospects appeared dim. Swedish laws prevented women from employment as church organists. For 4 years, Elfrida and her father Andreas attempted to change the law, but Parliament resisted. Eventually, in 1860, their petitions were successful, and she soon found work at several churches in Stockholm. In 1866, one of the most important organist positions in the country opened, at the Gustav Cathedral in Gothenburg, Sweden's second largest city. Andrée applied, along with 7 men. The committee selected her unanimously. She had become Europe's first female cathedral organist, and held this position until her death in 1929. Feminism was a driving force behind Andrée's activities as a musician. Throughout her career, she forcefully advocated for women to be taken seriously as professional musicians. In 1870, she wrote, "How many times have I not felt disgust when someone has written or spoken the truism that no woman can be named, when the topic is about musical composition in the serious style. It would be easier to tear a piece from a rock than to tear me away from my ideal, the elevation of womankind." She adopted these last 4 words as her motto. Andrée would ultimately become the first woman in Sweden to conduct orchestras, write symphonies, and emphasize large-scale chamber and orchestral music as a composer. It seems only fitting that her final major work, the cantata for the 1911 conference, would summarize many of her feminist political ideals. As summarized in Table 1 of the handout, the cantata is divided into 5 movements that each illustrate some aspect of women's history in Sweden. The first suggests a religious justification for women's rights. It extols Saint Bridget of medieval Sweden, whom Catt in the conference's keynote address had it described as the first women's rights woman in the world, for she was outspoken and emphatic in her demand for women's freedom. The cantata characterizes Bridget as a woman whose words were, and I quote, inspired by God. Much of this movement restates a march-like four-measure idea that characterizes Bridget's zeal as bold and constant. I play the opening from the manuscript vocal score. Two movements titled För, meaning then, follow. These comment on the past oppression of Sweden's women. The first of these movements contrasts the heroics of Sweden's leading men with the plight of its women. Turning to the second then movement, the choir repeatedly and dispiritedly utters why women remained helpless and unheard despite their labors. The reason was simple, but hard to see, that it must be so. The fourth movement focuses upon the Swedish writer Fredrika Bremer, whom Kant had recognized as an internationally influential advocate for women's rights. The soloist takes her voice. She calls upon women to vakna upp, or wake up from their long dormancy and recognize their power as citizens. Andrée's chromatic setting of the word medborgarina, meaning woman citizen, characterizes this concept as transformative. Each time this word is sung, it symbolically gathers strength. At first, only the soloist performs it, as if Bremer is a lone voice preaching wisdom. By the end, the entire choral force sings it and conveys a sense of solidarity, progress, and hope. The final movement, nu, meaning now, follows. It joyously foretells a new dawn for women, who are joined together in making progress toward a shared goal. Contemporaneous English language sources typically fail to recognize the ideological substance of the cantata. Most references to the cantata in the published conference report are cursory, aside from some brief comments in a description on the conference's social activities. English language media also generally credited the text author before the composer, and sometimes even mistook her for the composer. These English-speaking authors may have been familiar with the cantata primarily through the published libretto, provided in the original Swedish and in an English translation by a Miss J.E. Kennedy. Even those English speakers who attended the performance were in a weak position to analyze the cantata for musical meaning. The text of the cantata deviates from the published libretto, whose English translation also obscures some of the meanings of the original Swedish. Kennedy, for example, translated medborgarina as woman enfranchised. The more literal translation, woman citizen, idealizes a broader concept of women's civic engagement. In contrast to the English-speaking press, many of the politically sympathetic Swedish attendees at the premiere of the cantata would have been aware of Andrée's groundbreaking accomplishments. Many of them also understood how it reflected some of the composer's own perspectives. When the women's magazine Dagny previewed the conference, it drew special attention to the cantata. Immediately after an overview of the week's proceedings, it printed the cantata's text alongside an article summarizing its content. The magazine described Andrée's cantata as a product of the composer's personal feelings based on life experience. It was an expression of what a burning human heart felt over a very long life, the deepest and strongest compassion for those thousands and thousands of women who had struggled and hoped through the centuries, as the composer has. Turning to the suffrage cantata's musical content, it unambiguously reinforces the primary goal of the conference, women's suffrage. I now demonstrate how the cantata musically communicates ideologies particular to the composer, much as a spoken or written manifesto might. I have already suggested how the cantata's text illustrates a national struggle whose broad political themes would have resonated with an international audience. I now contend that the composer's particular brand of musical nationalism had long been intertwined with her feminism. Andrée was typically ambivalent to the idea of a nationalist musical aesthetic. None of her instrumental music uses a Swedish program, and it almost never references folk song. Instead, her most conventionally nationalist music frequently had a feminist agenda. This held true as early as the 1870s. Take, for instance, the 1874 march-like choral song Vakna, meaning awaken. It conveys feminist and patriotic double meanings. Victor Rydberg first published the poem with an essay in which he critiqued a novel about two Scandinavians who traveled abroad and returned, having forgotten their native languages. In this context, the text encouraged Swedes to awaken from complacency and rid their speech of foreign words. Andrée's biographer, Eva Öström, however, stresses how the composer conveyed another interpretation through the text. Women should also awaken to their untapped potential for civic, educational, and professional engagement. This concept of awakening was referenced in other Swedish feminist contexts, including Andrée's suffrage cantata. Although the proceedings of the 1911 conference prioritized women's political equality, Andrée's cantata strongly advocates for another cause especially dear to her, that of professional equality. Not only has she become Sweden's first female church organist, orchestra conductor, and even certified telegraph operator, she'd also never married and had been financially independent for almost half a century by the time of the cantata's composition. Andrée's setting of the text is harshly critical of traditional conceptions of women's work. In the first of the two then movements, she repeatedly presents a forlorn, recurring setting of the words Mor satt hemma och spann, mother sat home and spun. I play its first appearance. As I demonstrate in example 1 of the handout, Andrée's music later suggests that menial tasks like spinning wool are a core cause of women's oppression and helplessness. As the orchestra transitions between the two then movements, alternating 16th notes illustrate the motion of the spinning wheel. The double reeds remind the audience of this image by restating the mother sat home and spun melody. The motion of the spinning wheel slows. Its alternating 16ths transform into a sigh-like motive of a rising half step that begins the second funeral march-like then movement. This movement dwells upon women's suffering. The near relentless use of this rising half step constantly reminds us of the hardship caused by expectations that women focus on unsatisfying, undervalued tasks like spinning. I now play this transition between the two then movements. Andrée's approaches to style and genre in the cantata also advocate for professional equalities in ways that I consider personal. The composer had long reacted strongly against expectations conventionally applied to female musicians, both in her writings and in her favored approach to composition. She was keenly aware of how women of her era, if they were to compose at all, were frequently expected to write shorter, simpler songs and piano pieces suitable for amateur enjoyment. After the disastrous premiere of her 1869 First Symphony, the earliest known symphony by a Swedish woman, she specifically rebuked her father's suggestions that she shift her attention to genres supposedly more suitable for women. She wrote, "I do not want the popularity of all those little ladies writing piano fantasies and nice songs with kingly lyrics. I instead strive for the esteem of admirable musicians." Andrée not only favored prestigious genres like the symphony and string quartet, he also consistently and unapologetically situated her music within the stylistic milieu of leading male composers whom she most admired, as if to announce that she was operating on similar turf. Her earlier works, in particular, advertise a strong affinity toward leading German symphonists of previous generations. The scherzo of her 1879 Second Symphony, for example, quite clearly responds to Beethoven's example. Andrée's related treatment of genre and style in the cantata, heavy with high prestige continental influences on light and superficial markers of Swedishness, helps it suggest a universal message within a Swedish context. It also showcases women's potential as serious musical artists. Compared to examples from her earlier instrumental music, the Suffrage cantata adopts a more recent model, Richard Wagner. Andrée treats the mother sat home and spun melody like a leitmotif, and, as example 1 demonstrates, transitions more or less seamlessly between movements to construct a continuous drama. In addition, she sophisticatedly delays harmonic resolution for dramatic effect, much as Richard Wagner might. In the optimistic final movement, for instance, she implies the D major tonic almost immediately, but consistently resolves to chromatic harmonies. She avoids a root position tonic cadence until the last 2 lines of the final stanza of text, all the way in measure 86. This delay makes the ultimate harmonic resolution, 13 measures later, all the more satisfying. Here, the woman's chorus sings jubilantly in anticipation of a new dawn for women. I play the concluding measure. Andrée's Suffrage cantata musically advertises the composer's long-standing advocacy for professional equality for women, her conscious defiance of stereotypes conventionally assigned to female musicians, and her association of women's civic engagement with Swedish nationalism. Whereas the cantata reinforces the pro-suffrage themes of the 1911 Conference of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, it also emphasizes particular ideological agenda of its composer, much as if she were presenting a speech or manifesto. Thank you.